Hi, I'm Tom Field with Information Security Media Group. I want to welcome you to this panel on the insider threat. Really pleased to introduce our panelists today. To my immediate right is Tony Pepper. He's the CEO with Egress Software Technologies, followed by Solomon Adote, CISO with the state of Delaware, Sujit Bambawali, CISO with 7-Eleven, and Don Capelli, who is the Global Security and Chief Information Security Officer with Rockwell Automation. Folks, thank you so much for taking time to join me today.
Thanks for having us.
We want to talk about the insider threat, and to get started, I'd like to have you each sort of take a moment to talk about yourselves and your roles and how the insider threat impacts your jobs. And Don, I'm going to start with you because literally you wrote the book on the insider threat.
Well, we call it insider risk, not insider threat. Our employees don't like to be seen as threats. They're just another risk. But our insider risk program reports to me as CISO, but I actually am in the Office of General Counsel. So we have our insider risk program in legal, and our executive sponsor is HR. And of course, we partner very closely with IT. So yeah, it keeps us very busy.
I bet. Sujit, I'm sure you've got a unique perspective as well.
I see security as a mix of creative and technology disciplines, and I think people keep it very creative. So I think the insider risk is creative gone bad, perhaps accidentally, to use your term, but I think it's one of the most important parts of information security for an organization.
Yeah. And Solomon, from the public sector perspective, how does this intersect with your role?
It's quite interesting, you know, when you're in a major company and you're centralized, you have visibility and you have control. In a public sector environment where agencies used to be independent entities and you're trying to bring them all together to collaborate, share information, and provide better services to our citizens, it becomes a significant risk to address because it's almost close to impossible to have the control across the board. So we go for visibility, and we use the tools that we know are available and try to mitigate that risk that we're seeing.
And Tony, from your perspective as a software vendor, why is the insider threat of such importance to you?
Well, I think for our business, you know, we're seeing it's now the number one issue for businesses globally to solve, and I think what was the original perimeter is now gone away, and now I think people are the new perimeter in all businesses. So as a cybersecurity business, our mission is to build technical controls that customers can use to really mitigate that risk, but also enable people to ultimately be able to do their jobs, be able to be productive, but ultimately be able to help them avoid some of the most basic mistakes that are often not malicious. They're often occasionally reckless, but most importantly, they're just people that are tired, overworked, and just often make mistakes. So we need to build technology that can kind of cater for those kind of use cases.
Well, Tony, you make a good point. It sort of comes back to what Sujit said about creative gone bad. It used to be when we talked about the insider threat or risk that we were talking about someone that intended to do harm, intended to commit fraud or steal intellectual property. Friends, how have you seen the insider risk evolve over the past several years?
I think I can start that. It started with just the ability to really provide a better service. You know, you have health and social services individual trying to work better with somebody in the Department of Motor Vehicles to provide transportation or somebody who needs state services. They just go to send an email, and then that risk happens. Or they try to work from home because they have to get to their kids, and then they put some information on a USB stick. That's that risk happens. So it's all intended in just looking for an opportunity to add value, and it creates this opportunity.
I guess when I started in this area in 2001, my big hope was that someday there would be a technology out there that would pull all these diverse data sources together and enable you to detect these things right away. And we've gotten to that point. So that's very exciting to me. It used to be much more manual. And thank you to the vendor community for actually making our jobs much easier than they used to be.
But Don, also when you started, you were focused on that malicious insider, and I think it was you when you were at Carnegie Mellon that coined the phrase accidental insider. The risk has evolved.
Right. And the thing is, it may be accidental, but it's still putting your IP at risk, or it's putting your network at risk if the accidental insider is downloading some kind of tool that is going to put your network at risk or might have ransomware in it. So yeah, it's still dangerous.
I try to put some structure around the why, because I want to understand the mind of my adversary, whether it's internal or external. And I tend to break it down to 4 buckets: competition, compensation, attribution, and affirmation. And I think that all 4 of those can apply to an insider as much as it applies to an external person. So for me, for those reasons, insider risk, accidental or not, is something that we have to pay very close attention to.
And certainly you are.
Yeah, I think Dawn makes a great point. I think 10 years ago, the technology just wasn't available to do this because, and look, it's a really complex problem, right? Ultimately, you've got to look at human behavior and you have to predict in real time when someone's about to make an error of judgment. I think, the cyber community often focuses on those malicious issues, which actually represents 1 or 2% of the challenges that every business faces. The overwhelming majority of cases is just accidental. But I think to capture that is a much, much more difficult problem, and therefore technology does need to catch up. And that's where there's been a whole spate of machine learning that comes in. But I think if you now blend machine learning with kind of context-aware DLP to ultimately give people the ability to kind of understand where they're making mistakes or not, I think that's where you get something really meaningful. But I think one of the things that we see, which is more concerning, is actually the accidental breach of security is the most unreported breach globally. And it sounds pretty obvious when you think about it. If I emailed Tom and Tom replied back to me and said, hey, was this meant for me? I think I'm not too sure if I'd raise my hand and kind of tell security, because there's a kind of blame culture globally. But I think the second is probably more relevant to us all, which is if you send something accidentally to the wrong person and you don't know, how do you even know to report that? So I think one of the areas technology's also fallen short with the enterprise is actually CISOs don't have the data to actually tell them how big the problem really is.
And one caution I always say anytime I talk to you, Tom, about insider threat or insider risk is people tend to think of insider threat as theft of IP.
Right.
And insider cyber sabotage is still happening out there. And that's one that you really need to be on top of. And it's harder, it's much harder, but it's a really important threat to be aware of.
Now, you started the conversation about technology. I'd be curious, what role can technology play in detecting and preventing some of these risks?
If I may, I love your point about predictive insights. And I think technology could help us get to predictive insights when it comes to insider threat. Sometimes they don't know what they're doing is accidentally wrong, or sometimes we need to catch it ahead of time. So I think that the industry has focused a lot on log aggregation, log ingestion, correlation, and giving us the ability to search. We should now use AI and ML to pivot to having predictive insights and say, well, is Tom the right person to do this email, right? And if it seems no, then say no, tune us, right? But the predictive insights would be a great outcome of technology in this space.
Good.
And the key is having HR data, because our research from CERT from all those years ago still holds. People that are really intentionally stealing your IP tend to do it when they're leaving the company. So getting that HR data, knowing that someone's leaving, having a good relationship with HR so that if you're having a reduction in force or you have an employee that you're going to be letting go, you need that up front. So that way, your technology, you can build those risk models that take the contextual employee data plus all their online activity and create risk algorithms that say, oh, you better look at him today.
Yes, and it's the context, right? Just data without context might not tell you the full story. It's just, really it's become about anomaly detection. What is abnormal about this activity? And alert on it, or even advice to users. Sometimes it's just making them aware. You're about to do this. Is this what you really want to do? And that sometimes is all that you need to just prevent a significant catastrophe.
I think from our perspective, probably one of the most groundbreaking but more obvious kind of observations is that if you look at the way technology vendors have traditionally approached it. It's all been edge technology. Let's
right.
take end users out of the equation. Let's take employees out of the equation because they can't figure this out for themselves. It's an IT problem. So they put everything at the boundary, right, Tom? And I think what we've seen now is actually you can't do that. You've got to engage with employees. You've got to engage with end users, and therefore that gives you an ability to really understand that rich context. But most importantly, B, you can actually then preventatively assess and analyze what's going on at the point of send, and then avoid the risk from happening before it's actually taken place. So I think it's not only a shift of culture of using technology to kind of better predict behavior, but it's also a shift in culture in wrap people with technology so that they work in hand and glove.
It's almost like controls following the data.
Absolutely right. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
So if you look at the technology factors and the non-technology factors, what's needed to further mature the insider risk programs that we have today to keep pace with?
I think she made a great point. I think the risk models that come out of the use cases that HR could help us with, I think would be wonderful, right?
Yeah, and our UEBA tool, we just have our insider risk analysts sit in front of that tool. They get into it, and in the morning, they just start with the highest risk in the entire company, and they start digging in.
Yep.
And it's become that effective. What we need to look at is from a sabotage perspective. If our CCERT detects, for instance, an employee downloaded a hacking tool, it used to be they would go to the employee and say, get that off of there, you're not allowed to use that, and that's it. Case closed, we mitigated the threat. Now they don't do that. They tell our insider risk team, the insider risk team talks to the manager, to HR, is there anything going on with this employee? Is there a reason for that?
So it really is see something, say something.
Yes. Now, if that CSIRT data, I think the next step is to figure out how to use the UEBA tool to detect sabotage so that in their risk, in their order of risk, it would just show up in there. So you could go in and use the technology to investigate everything.
So you're collecting like points to ponder over time.
Yes.
Right.
Very
right.
nice. Sorry, go ahead.
In my environment, I looked at a whole security strategy again, and I work with my team to come up with a strategy that this might seem a little bit complex, but it's an identity-driven, risk-aware information security framework. So the core is identity. When I explained the strategy to people, I said I work alongside each individual, known or unknown, identify a particular identity, and for each step, I assess that step. Is that activity good or is that activity bad? Continue working. If it's good, is it bad? And then I take action. So we've had to remove the reliance on, like Jim said, the perimeter controls, and now follow that identity wherever it goes and whatever it does, with context about who you are. I know where you work. I know your department. I know how you interact with our systems. I have that data. Now I can actually help you along your way to do your job more effectively.
Very good.
I think it's. I love what Dawn said at the outset, which is technology needs to catch up, because it's great as talking about what we'd like to do, but if the technology isn't available, then it's difficult, right? And I think because of the advances in machine learning, but more importantly, how we apply those to very real use cases of today, I think what we're now able to do is deliver capability that does not need updating. So it isn't an IT security team that's having to tweak rules at the boundary, and if rules change rules. But also even those rules that we've put in place historically, they're not specific to Dawn. They don't understand exactly your working patterns, who you communicate to, who you don't. So I think where we need to get to now in industry is a place whereby we have capability that's very specific to you, that also doesn't need to be managed or updated. And I think the only way to do that is using machine learning, but is using a kind of breadth of data, all that information that we store within the business to feed into those models to drive real, genuine business outcomes.
Terrific discussion.
Yeah, because right now we are not at the point, I don't want to give anybody the wrong idea that technology will do it all. Like in Rockwell, we create industrial control systems. We have software engineers. If we have a disgruntled engineer that wants to plant malicious code in our product, right now there's no technology that's going to detect that. So, you still, there's the human element,
Right,
and it
course.
still is important. And
absolutely.
fortunately, what we know from our work, the research at CERT, is that there are human behavioral, social behavioral cues. And so you still need to train your HR. We use HR around the world to understand what to look for.
Very well said, folks. We could build an entire conference around this. But thank you for taking time today to speak about this. Don, Sajid, Solomon, Tony, grateful. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
My
Thank you,
pleasure.
guys.
We've been talking about the insider threat for Information Security Media Group. I'm Tom Field. Thank you very much.